come on. So really nice to see everyone. Good evening and welcome everyone. Great to see you all again. This is the final session of the year in December. And Carolyn and I were just chatting just now. This is the end of year 4 for our environment group that all of you have been part of, many of you for quite a few of those years. So that's amazing in itself. So here we are 4 years later and we're going strong. So I'd like to start by saying we acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Yep, so great to see everyone. And tonight's topic is really, really interesting one. So we're going to be talking about two things really. One is with Lex is around measuring emissions, and then we're going to hear from Kate around the impact from a recent trip that she's had to Antarctica. So the format we're going to do is we're going to hear from Lex Lynch first. We'll talk about Snapshot Climate Tool. Then Carolyn and I will probably just ask a few questions, then throw it over to the group for any questions you may have for Lex. And then after that, we're going to hear from Dr. Kate Sinclair, who's also a member of our group, and in the past couple of weeks has just returned from a trip to Antarctica. So she'll be talking about showing some of her pictures and also talking about some of the impacts of climate change that she saw on that trip. And then that'll be followed by questions for Kate as well. Now, we also thought, given it's the last session of the year, and that we don't do a session in January, so there's a bit of a break, it might be nice if any of you have been listening or any sort of interesting podcast that you've you're listening to at the moment related to the environment, biodiversity, climate, etc. Maybe add them in the chat, and that might be nice for any members of the group to have a listen to whilst we have a break as well. So, introducing Lex. Welcome, Lex. It's great to have you here. Lex has extensive experience in the climate area over many, many years. We were just talking about a bit of that then. He's going to discuss the Snapshot Climate Tool, which is a tool that enables people to look at the emissions in their particular electorate, as well as, quite interestingly, to really focus on the heaviest emitters in their electorate as well. He also has expertise working with local governments, communities on climate action, and some of his roles have included Climate for Change and way back the Environmental Jobs Network. So thanks for joining us, Lex, and over to you.
Thanks, Stephen and Carolyn, and thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. While I just get my screen ready. That all working? You can see the right version of it there? Awesome. Yeah, thank you. It's lovely to be introduced to you guys, and I guess I also want to thank Judy McClellan, who I'm not sure if she's here tonight, but I've been sort of working on and off with her role in Gold Coast and all the climate stuff that they're doing there, who put us on to these guys and introduced us. So thank you very much to her and to everyone. I just want to acknowledge I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Naarm in Melbourne, and want to acknowledge them as traditional owners and pay respects to past, present and emerging. I'm going to just give a bit of a rundown on the work that local governments are doing, because most of the context and background to the Snapshot tool that Stephen mentioned and the work that we do is sort of through the lens of local government. A little bit on the increasing ambition and the change, potentially some of the ways that I'd suggest, liaising with and keeping local government in mind, getting onto the Snapshot tool, and a bit about how that can potentially help inform action and advocacy. Just really quickly, so Ironbark are an organisation that just works with councils and their communities around Australia. We've been around for 15, 20 years. All we do is work with councils on their operational emissions, their lighting their buildings, climate action plans, strategies, the works. I don't think I need to go into that too much detail. As Stephen mentioned, I've been working sort of with local governments on climate-related work for a good 20-odd years now. Where are we? Computer, surely it's easier now. All right. A couple of times over the last sort of 10, 15 years, ourselves at Ironbark and other organisations like the Climate Council and their Cities Power Partnership Program, Beyond Zero Emissions and ICLEI, so these representative groups of councils, have got together to survey councils around Australia and ask them all sorts of questions about, where they're at, what they're doing, how they're going, what their challenges are, And the most recent one of these reports was released a couple of years ago. We're about to develop another one too. I'll put this link in the chat as well if people are interested. But basically what we do is we get this really awesome bit of data, case studies, the work that's going on that just helps us all understand and then share back to the sector the sort of things that are working and the sort of things that councils might be struggling with. What it also means is that we can use this to work on advocacy and make sure we're all on the same page. There's a document there. It's a really massive file, I'm afraid. And sort of get a feel for what's business as usual and what's, the work that's going out there, what can be replicated. And so what we've found is, and so when we're talking about the things that council do, we've got their corporate operational stuff. So this is the things that they have complete control over. So their street lights, their buildings, their fleet, etc. And they've been working on this for a good 20, 25 years. When I first started working in local government and climate, which is a bit over 20 years ago, there were already big programs where councils were working and working on climate action and doing things in the community. So what we've got is most councils have got like an inventory. They understand where they're at. They've got targets. They've got a plan and action, and everyone is doing something. So whether that's, putting solar on council buildings or upgrading lighting in their facilities, the stuff that they have complete control over, it's all happening, and it has been for quite a while. Electric charging for their own fleet, massive renewables on leisure centres. So this is Coburn in WA that, have already hit their 2020 target of 20% of electricity from renewables. So they've got a new target of 100% by 2030, getting off gas at leisure centres, which used to be in the too hard basket for councils and organisations, but has radically changed in the last year or two. Sunshine Coast. So this is one of the sort of behemoth councils that we have in southeast Queensland. First council to offset all of its electricity consumption across its facilities from renewables, their own solar farm, PPAs, which power purchase agreements, I'm sure most of you or everyone will be familiar with from looking at the people that have spoke on these things before. Massive one in Victoria with, 60% of the councils. There's another one in Western Australia now with 48 of their councils, and lots in New South Wales as well, where essentially all of their electricity emissions are now renewable. What's a lot more important though, and what councils, again, have sort of been looking at, but will need to increasingly focus on, is the broader community or municipal action. So this is everything else that's out there, the residential and commercial or industrial emissions within the community, households, businesses, transport, waste, the works. So generally, a council is going to be only responsible for 1 or 2% of the emissions within their community. They can control that. But when you think about the 99% that's outside of their control, but they can still influence or advocate for change, this is sort of more commensurate with the challenge that we are all facing, and where councils really need to lift their ambition, have been and continue to do. So most councils that responded, they've got or are developing community-wide targets. They've got plans and strategies for action within the community, and they're doing stuff. They are working in the community on community action. So in SA, for example, Adelaide, SA sort of making that transition to a low carbon economy. The state and the city are working together to try and get 500% renewable energy by 2050. Hobart, a lot of what do they got there? Hydro, so not as much electricity emissions. Waste is a big thing. Diverted 75,000 odd tonnes of green waste from landfill. Charging stations, if councils are involved in this, there's a lot of these sort of examples. Some of my favourite stuff though, and I'm guessing you've probably even had Comms Declare come over your journey here, but I can't read that. I'll come back to those things. The fossil ad ban that a lot of councils are taking up now, which I think is potentially has a much bigger chance of advocating and making a really big difference. And just in the newspaper today, I understand Stephen and Carolyn from Inner West. So Inner West and Lane Cove today, the latest government councils to use their planning powers to stop new building, connecting the gas network. So these are the sort of things that they are doing within the community, which, the scale of it means that it's going to have a much bigger difference than their own facilities where they've got control, but it's a smaller amount, where we want to see the increasing of ambition, which we're seeing. So the concept of the climate emergency really started at Darebin City Council in Victoria about 6 or 7 years ago. And what that has meant is a big change from just the small piecemeal stuff to maybe looking at, an emergency footing, and understanding that, the business as usual sort of climate action that councils have been undertaking needs to be put on supercharge. And also a lot of working collectively. So I think one of the good things, and I was looking at some of your resources that you guys have sent out through your Trello board and others, is the amount of organisations and groups that work in concert with others. And so councils have been very good at doing this for a long time, working in regional groupings or alliances to make sure that they can essentially get better bang for their buck, and I guess have a bit of a new business as usual, if you like. And so this is from the report, the earlier report, all of that corporate or operational work, the lighting, the solar on buildings, waste reduction, EV, it's all great. And of course, it all needs to continue. But if we're talking about broader climate action and supporting, just changing lights, then we're in a lot of trouble, because we need to go a lot further than that. And business as usual for local government when it comes to climate change really needs to be in that broader 98, 99%. And so that's a lot of the focus of increasing the focus of our work. And councils are getting better at sharing information and looking at these challenging areas. And what we're trying to do, and what the tool that I'm about to show you is all about, making sure that they're armed, and everyone is armed with the best information to make sure that they can put into place community actions that are best targeted at what's happening within their municipality. All right. A couple of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, we were talking to our friends at Beyond Zero Emissions, who were helping support community groups, climate action groups of 10, 15 people around Australia, and getting into data and trying to understand how to work with this horrifically named Global Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Emissions Inventory thing, which is basically the accounting to help develop a community inventory or profile. Meanwhile, we were doing it for councils for, a small sort of $4 or $5 grand a pop, not knowing really what we're going to do with it yet. We chatted to BZE and just realised that, if we've got community groups who are spending their time trying to actually figure out what the emissions footprint, if you like, is of their municipality, then none of us are really doing our jobs. So we got together, we got some funding from Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, and then a bunch of other orgs, and then even other organisations and councils, and then technical review to make sure all our data was okay from those organisations that you can see now, to put together all of the data that we had onto a platform so anyone could use it. It's free to use. The main thing is that every time we improve the data as well, with every iteration, we lift not just one snapshot profile for one council or one client, but all 537 councils in Australia, and now electorates and states as well. So it's a free and publicly available emissions profile tool, also helped along by these awesome sponsors. So I'm not sure if you've got anyone from any of these councils here, but if you are in one of those council areas, please let them know that you appreciate their funding to keep it free. I'm now going to try and stop sharing my screen and go to some live stuff, so I can show you what it means, and then show you some of the behind the scenes stuff, which I think is the interesting stuff to get to today. So just bear with me, sorry. Okay, Chrome. Let's see how this works. Can anyone see the Inner West emissions profile? Yep. If I do that, can you see Wollongong or still Inner West?
Wollongong.
Awesome. This is the Inner West snapshot profile. So Inner West, 1.2 million tonnes per year. You can jump in there and play around. It's just snapshotclimate.com.au. You can go and look at any emissions profile, and it's all there, and you can get into a little bit more detail and look at, for example, where the residential emissions are from. Let's go back again. Transport. The data comes from various places. All the methodology is listed online. And so what we can see is for an inner city council like Wollongong, 1.2 million tonnes, we can see, res 23, commercial 25%. One of the first things that Snapshot did was that it helped a lot of councils and community groups suddenly look at where they're putting their attention, and it's often scant resources, and potentially move away. So often people would be surprised that waste was such a small amount 6% is actually higher than usual. They might say that residential emissions were lower than expected, so they could start looking at other slices of the pie. Of course, every emissions profile is different. So if we go to Wollongong, and I'm going to use this because it's a bit of an outlier, 11 million tonnes, and a lot of industrial processes, which is probably unsurprising. Electricity, 11, and what's more, the electricity is industrial as well. There's a little bit more info here, but I won't get into it too much detail because you can just jump in and have a look and compare your financial or calendar year. And you can also go back and explore and look at entire states or electorates. What have I got? Can look at the Adelaide electorate as opposed to municipality, and say federal electorate snapshots as well. What we've been trying to do, though, is to look at how we can even make it a little bit more valuable. So using Wollongong and Inner Western as an example, if you're looking, or if you're a council or a community group looking for the best place to look at directing evidence-based climate action, this gives you a bit of an idea. You also need to know, for example, that residential slice, 23%, is going to start going down regardless of what a council or even a community group does as the grid starts decarbonising. If you're a council, you could look at residential solar programs, but really it's close to taking care of itself through the market and a lot of federal programs and boom and bust state programs over the year. If you're a Wollongong and you want to find out where the biggest piece of the pie is, you can see this industrial thing here. But even then, you might not know, is that like 5 or 6 big organisations, or is it, you know, hundreds of small businesses? What's going on there? And so the next part of the puzzle, which is, this is purely back-end stuff. I'm assuming you can all see a Power BI thing here. Yep. Yep, great. Thanks. What we're doing now is actually making, developing some tools so we can actually, let's just increase this a little bit. Sorry, there we go. You can actually identify who the key emitters are. So you can go down, and this is still, at the moment, this is sort of a bit of a beta version or a paid version, so councils can pay for it. We would love to make this available to every council as well, but it needs to also pay for itself. But what you can see, for example, is, and this is the same, this is the 1.3 million tonnes, but you can actually zoom into the users who are the big electricity, the big emitters. So in the West, Rail Corps, New South Wales, and you get your supermarkets, your IGAs and your IKEAs, a lot of not available data because there's a lot of small emitters. You compare that to a Wollongong, for example, there's that 11.5 million tonnes, and I'll just come straight down here to key emitters. You can see that there's that big industrial chunk there. And this thing here is one organisation, and of course that's BlueScope, which is 8.5 million tonnes. The next one down, collieries, other coal organisations. And so the idea and the intention is that we can actually, councils and community groups can use this to make sure that you're focusing your attention where it should be. You can actually then liaise with organisations that are in your municipality and potentially try and find out whether they've already got plans to get to zero, in which case you can probably move on to the next piece of the pie. I'm going to go back to my Prezo, and I can come back to that later if you wanted to have a bit of a look around. But in the meantime, I'm going to just mention a few quick things that I think one of the things that we're interested in exploring more too with this is that there are new mandatory climate disclosure rules coming into play. It's expected from mid-July 2024, I think it is. And so at the moment, as well as councils, we're working with businesses to prepare for this first stage of reporting, bring them into this sort of reporting environment so councils and reporting organisations can also understand their up and downstream emissions. And potentially this is also where you can, I guess, have a bit of better bang for your buck as far as where your time and effort is spent. One of the things that I often end up talking about when it comes to then where your time is best spent, especially sort of with community groups. And I think, look at a lot of the ways that councils, and I think the way councils have progressed over the journey, the last 20 odd years especially, has been starting to look at the things that they can control in their own carbon footprint, and then looking broader and bigger, which is the same thing that we see when you often, I'm sure you get it when you talk to your friends and family. And one of the things they were trying to do is really shift the narrative that they've been brought up with as soon as possible. So instead of just looking at their own carbon footprint, but having a bit more of a laser focus where their time and their very scant resources is spent, and where to focus climate action, especially if that's the number one priority. Because we've spent too much time, I think, listening to sort of these guys. And I think from, again, looking at some of your resources that you've got, I think you're speaking to the converted a little bit here, but I found this article, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and, it's the 9 things you can do about climate change. And, next to it, they've got their world's billionaires list. And I think, whatever a billionaire says or wants you to do, you should generally advocate for the exact opposite, with a few exceptions with Cannon Brooks and, Yvonne Chouinard from Patagonia. But generally, when I see these sort of things, the advice that I'm getting and the 9 things that I can do about reducing emissions, which are very focused on the individual, including line drying my clothes, someone from Forbes telling me to feel good about myself and the fossil fuels I'm not burning, a very visceral response to that. And I guess the political project of neoliberalism that sort of quickly tells us that we've got to reduce our 7 tons to 4 or 5 while the world keeps kind of burning, when the actual 9 things are these big things like decarbonise the grid now, get off gas now, stop Adani and Viva, massive rollout of EVs or hydrogen vehicles for, large fleet or whatever it is, which are very difficult things to do if you're an individual. There's probably only a handful of individuals in the world that can actually do something there. And so the real things, and this is by far and away my favourite climate-related article of all time. I know you're asking for podcasts before, but I'll just chuck this in here. So this is some of the, our climate heroes: Bill McKibben, Michael Mann, Gina McCarthy, Paul Hawken. They're all asked this question: what's the most effective thing that someone can do to help reverse global warming? And there are 4 things it gets down to: vote candidates that prioritise energy transition, lobby, advocate for policies that incentivize renewables, get informed, and talk to people. I know one of the network's your actions is to make it changes ourselves, big or small, to reduce carbon footprint. And so this is not about not doing the small stuff, the solar panels, the eating less meat, for example, but making sure that we very quickly look at the sort of things that are commensurate to the challenge that we've got. And so if you're in Wollongong, you want to maybe be armed with information to look at what we can do about that, as well as the really small stuff. Or if you're in Inner West and you're looking at that 1.2 million tonnes and potentially trying to, get on council's door and knocking on them and asking them why they haven't got that kindergarten down the road with solar on their roofs, just remembering that there's this project going on right now, or maybe going on, that has the emissions of 92 times, I better do this and hold it down because it takes a while, 92 times Inner West emissions a year. Does anybody know what this one is?
Give us a clue. Just a clue. Oh, yeah, fracking in Northern Territory. Thank you.
So it's Beetaloo Basin, is it?
Yeah. So 92 times those emissions. And so I hope I'm not trying to suggest that, that the action with the councils or what's happening within that municipality is not important, but the sooner I think that a local government and a community group can really sort of lift their gaze and look at where their attention's best spent, we're going to get, we're going to actually be fighting the fight on the terms that's required. So, it's not just about ending on a crap note like Beetaloo, but also making sure that we're fastening action as soon as possible. I saw that you had Climate for Change come and speak last year, and Katarina earlier this year, Katarina Gator, who I work with at Climate for Change, which is just the most brilliant and beautiful model, like the process of getting the Teal candidates in, I think, because it's about talking to people and voting and doing the things which will actually spread to make sure that we can do the things that individually is a lot more challenging. Or probably the best way it can be put is to be looking at your, not your carbon footprint, which is something that was developed and popularized by BP. So instead of looking at their emissions, you can look at yours, and instead worrying about your carbon shadow and the things that you can influence and advocate. There are only a few people or organizations in the world where their carbon footprint really matters. For the rest of us, it's our shadow and the sort of things that we can advocate for to make sure that the emissions fall as soon as possible. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Lex. That's fantastic. That was a really, really interesting. So thank you. A couple of quick questions that we'll ask, and then we'll anybody wants to jump in, just please do so. I mean, I think you've answered this a little bit, but I mean, if you think about our group here, and advocacy and using our influence is a big part, of what we're about. How can we best use Snapshot Climate Tool, do you think, to influence, particularly those big emitters? Any advice around that?
A very similar question I get, and we get at Ironbark a lot when it comes to the local government scene. So, it's the number one question, like if you're speaking in presentations, like what's the one thing a council can do? And the answer is it completely depends. Like if you're in Tasmania, it's very different to if you're in Victoria or New South Wales. If you've got a big agricultural, emissions, it's different to if you're an inner city council. There are a few things that are quite consistent that all those organisations will have, like transport. And so, or getting off gas, those bigger picture things. And I guess for you guys, it would also depend on where you are from. So I'm not sure, is everyone within, if you're in the West, then it's one story, but if you're sort of scattered around, it really depends on how and where the council is. Yeah, so for the City of Yarra in Victoria, for example, which is one of the leading progressive councils in Australia, the message is kind of, look, do a little bit more in Yarra, but God, they're already doing so much. You need to instead maybe try and focus your time on, some of the broader electoral changes that we need, or, divestment and these sort of things.
Yeah. Thanks, Lex. Adrian's asked here, what about, it's fantastic what you're doing. How exactly are you calculating the emissions?
It depends on the source. It's very detailed. And so we've got a few shorter sort of, there's quite a few, as you can imagine, presentations on Snapshot on its own, including just around the data. But basically, it's a mixture of top-down and bottom-up data. The main thing is that we stay consistent with that global protocol that I mentioned at the start, because local governments can use these to report, and they can report into global programs as long as it is consistent and verified with the standard. It's like NGAS, or climate active or climate friendly, whatever it is these days for corporate reporting. And so the main thing is it gets verified. But then, for example, if we have information that is at a granular level, so we can get real data on, say, electricity use from a distribution business, then that goes in. If we've got transport, for example, is traditionally a lot more challenging because you actually can't have a little thing on every single car within your municipality. So it's often modelled. But what we've been doing over the last few years is working with partners that can potentially improve the data. So Google is an example of that, where we get real data from Google that looks at, real trips and, extrapolates and calculates to determine where it is and, where the cars are going to and from. So we sort of start with this resource that's, it's got complete data, and that's the number one sort of rule within that protocol. And then bit by bit, we get it more and more accurate. If there's a council that's got their own emissions profile that's been developed themselves and they want to put it up there because it's more accurate, we just chuck it on. So there's a couple that have got their own up there as well, which we're happy to just put up.
Lex, you mentioned that some businesses are starting to use the tool, which is fantastic. And absolutely. There's a lot, especially the larger ones are seeing that deadline of July next year and needing to report, having mandatory reporting from then. So can you just tell us a little bit about how those businesses are tapping in, or how some businesses are tapping into the tool? Yeah,
look, what you see online is not what they're tapping into. And so we're still, we've got all the little iterative improvements over the last few years. So it's different from what you would have seen 4 or 5 years ago and 2 or 3 years ago. The most recent one was including fugitive emissions, and then, all those the more detailed subsectors weren't there. And so we improve every year. We always ask all the stakeholders, so councils and community groups, or anyone really wants to respond, what do you want to see next? And so targets comes up sometime. And so do we incorporate targets there somehow? Or, what are the key actions that you can do? There's so much stuff that we want to do, so many ideas out there. It eventually will come down to funding. And so those funders at the start were really quite generous in, funding little pockets of it. And I must say, all of the organisations, the state governments, the independent funders have all come through it, knowing that this is a resource that's for everyone. They're not just doing it for, say, the Queensland councils, for the Queensland government. So we've been really pleasantly surprised by that. The sort of the business side of things, and so how corporates and commercial entities interact, like it's still a bit of a work in progress for us. So we've got a few businesses that are keen on looking at how they can use their data for up and downstream emissions. And we're kind of even just testing it with those businesses. So we're working with a gold mining company of all types. You can imagine in New South Wales at the moment, to look at how they do their what's the initial thing they need to do, to find out how much they're disclosing, whether they're on the right track and this sort of stuff. What we're generally finding is that they're not, a lot of the organisations that we have started working with. So yeah, it's a bit of a work in progress, but the disclosure of a bit of a gap analysis is the first step for most of the ones we're working on. So trying to understand, all the required disclosure requirements that they've got, working with them to see how comprehensive it is, and then looking at a strategy to try and improve it, inventory of emissions, workshops to understand what to do, and then scope 3 analysis. And so in the tool at the moment that I showed you behind the scenes, we've got 60,000 emitters in there, which of all of Australia's 500, megatons or whatever it is, it's about 1 in every 3 tons we can now allocate to an organisation, and as more get involved, we can get better at that.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's
Lex.
fantastic. Yeah.
Really incredible.
When will you be able to, will somebody be able to go on and see the name of one of those big emitters, and when are you expecting that to happen?
At the moment, if the councils that pay for it can do it, and so that we've sort of got a software offering for anyone can really, but at the same time, we're like, if anyone here is interested, just give us an email and see what we can do, because we're still trying to figure out the best way to do it. Again, like Snapshot, tranche 1, ideally we would just put up there, but it's it's software development now, and so we're still trying to figure out the best way to do it. And so really open to ideas or people that work in this area. So for example, we've started speaking to accountants, because there are a few accountant organisations who are like probably the organisations that might have the systems and are already looking at the reporting requirements, because they already do financial reporting and they might do client reporting. And so maybe that's the way to work together on something like this and get the info out there. We're not entirely sure, but if anyone is interested, maybe just shoot us an email afterwards and I'll do my best.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, we've got a lot of accountants on this call, so anybody.
Yeah, they're really keen on chatting.
Yeah, great. Well, do let me know and I can link you up with Lex. Just while we've got you, Lex, just to broaden it out a bit, I presume you're following COP28, and any thoughts about what's taking place there at the moment?
It's the first COP where I've actually kind of tuned out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, we've tried to, so we're involved in one organisation that, I don't know if you guys are, Better Futures Australia. Have you guys been tapped into that? I think so Better Futures Australia sits under the CANA umbrella, so Climate Action Network Australia. And basically they've got all of civil society, the different groups. And so we're in the local government group. There is one of the other bigger, most involved groups is actually the sort of business and finance group, headed up by, going blank tonight. People that I imagine you probably even had on, Monica Richter, I think it is, from WWF, who has spoken and now runs MECLA, which is the Materials and Embodied Carbon Alliance. So they're a group that basically are trying to get the civil society that they represent. So for us, it's local government. For them, it's small business. There's others, faith groups, there's Indigenous groups, together to make asks to the federal government, and also how that can tie into COP. So in the past, we've been pretty heavily involved, and a lot of the focus that we've had is on local and non-state actors, to make sure that we are recognised with the ambition that we have with COP. I think I've found, like a few others, it's been a little bit harder to engage with some of the bigger stuff and the unabated fossil fuels or whatever the hell it is these days. And so I've stepped out of it, to be honest, even this time. Yep.
Good stuff. Well, thank you so much, Lex, for sharing the tool with us. It's fantastic. Keep up the great work. It's really, really good. And just giving everybody, really good practical things that we can then follow up with and have an impact with. So thank you so much. It's fantastic.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lex. So I'm delighted now to introduce Kate, Dr. Kate Sinclair. So some of you on the call know Kate. She's been an active member of our group. Kate, you might remember, stood as a Greens candidate in the federal election and also in the state election for the Victorian Senate seat about last year. Kate's just returned from a trip to Antarctica and has kindly agreed to share some of what she saw and experienced, and also the impact of climate change on Antarctica. So, Kate, perhaps we throw over to you at this point. And we can see your slides, but we can't hear you.
Now you should be able to hear me. That's right. Thank you, Carolyn and Steve, and thank you everybody for staying on the call. Also, recognising that I'm here on the Dja Dja Wurrung lands of the Jara people, and recognising the care for country and for community that they have committed for thousands of years, and the fragile lands that I'm on here and how well they've been cared for. So I'm talking about the Antarctic voyage that I just returned home from so that was a couple of weeks that I returned home, but my journey to Antarctica actually started about 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, I was working in health, working with children who had chronic pain, and had been doing research, and the clear information that I was getting was that children's pain is directly related to the environments that we're living in. And we often think about kind of the social environment and the social and economic conditions that people are living in, but we need to think more broadly and think about how families are living in a changing climate and changing environments, and that's having a direct impact on children.
Lost you. We might have just lost Kate for a second.
If she comes back.
Bad timing.
Anybody else been to Antarctica? I don't think so.
Oh, Jen.
Yeah, best month of my life almost.
When did you go, Jen?
For Mawson Centenary, so many. That's a 2012. Yeah, great. I'll shut up.
No, we got you as a backup.
We lost you, Katie.
I'm back, so I apologize, everybody. I'll try sharing screen again. All right, we'll see how we go. So I think I've dropped out when I mentioned Fabian Dattner, who was somebody who was looking at leadership. So she'd been working in leadership coaching for a long time after she was working in business in the 1980s. And what she'd observed was that a lot of the people around tables who were making decisions about climate action and about scientific kind of decisions were primarily men. And her leadership coaching was focusing on how it's often women who are working more collaboratively, have a more inclusive approach, tend to be more legacy minded and trusted with assets. So she developed a program called Homeward Bound, which is a leadership program for women with STEM backgrounds, so with science backgrounds. And it's an international program that you apply for. The program was meant to go for 12 months, so you have online training for 12 months. And that would then end with a trip down to Antarctica. And Antarctica was chosen because it's a very remote place. It's a place where you're completely immersed in the natural environment, where you're removed from any other kind of everyday living kind of life distractions. The climate itself and the weather there is incredibly changeable, but the climate is also changing too. And the Antarctica is seen as a key teacher in the program. So the program, I started the program in 2020 and started doing the online training, and we got started, and then COVID hit. And so, of course, the trip down to Antarctica got postponed. So we continued the online leadership training, and that gave us a chance to meet women from all around the world. And so started to build connections with women from many different countries and began looking at sort of collaborative projects. So this year we actually made it to Antarctica. So for our trip, we had 88 women with science backgrounds from 20 different countries. The scientific backgrounds that people had was very vast. So there were people like myself working in health. There were astrophysicists. There were people that were working in water, people who were ecologists, people who were working with mosses and birds. And so the important thing was bring all those people together so that we were sharing the one space and sharing that time with each other. The focus of the program was looking at leadership and complexity. So recognizing that the changes that the planet is going through at the moment is very rapid, and it's changing much faster than the climate scientists were initially predicting. And so with that rapidity of change, we need to be focusing very quickly on how we can respond to that and support communities to adapt, continue working on carbon zero and working on those policies, but helping to build communities as well. So we went down to Antarctica. The voyage that we went on was not on a big cruise ship. We went on the MV Ushuaia, which was built in the 1970s as a research vessel. It has since had a lot of its ballast taken out, and so it rolled. So when we first left the Beagle Channel and had our safety briefing, we were told that the kind of seas that we're in would either mean that we had to have one hand on the ship or two hands on the ship. We had to be really careful of the doorways because the fire doors in all the doorways would open up and then slam back, and they would regularly crush people's fingers. So you had to make sure you didn't have your hands in the doorways. And 2 days before the end of our trip, we actually did have somebody who was holding onto a doorway who'd taken medication to manage the seasickness, and the door slammed back and she ended up with a crushed thumb. So it felt like we were really immersed in the environment. The ship went through the Beagle Channel and then got to the Drake Passage at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I woke up to being rolled in the bed from one side to the other and had to brace myself immediately. We were lucky. We didn't actually have to put life jackets next to us so that when we were thrown into the wall, we didn't actually break bones. So right from the start, we were in a boat that was fairly basic, and we knew that this was very different to anything that we'd experienced. There's nothing like those kind of experiences to bring people together. And we had one room that we all worked in. I'm going to go back a step. So we had one room where 88 people would gather for programs, and we would spend the day working on common issues, talking about policy, talking about shared sciences, and learning about complexity theory and leading in those spaces. And then in the afternoon, we would get out and get into zodiacs and go out onto the ice. In the 2 weeks that we were in Antarctica, we only actually went on land 5 times. And that's because we're still very cold. And so often there would be a plan for us to get out on the ice, and the sea ice would come around and be between us and the land, so we couldn't actually get to the land. Or we would all be rugged up in our 7 layers of clothing to be able to go out onto the land when it was minus 30 degrees, and a snowstorm would hit and you wouldn't actually know it was coming. You couldn't see it. Everyone would get ready, and then suddenly would have called out of the loudspeaker that we couldn't get onto the zodiacs anymore. So the Antarctic, the weather itself was very extreme and very changeable and extremely cold. There were lots of days that we couldn't go outside onto the deck even because the deck was too iced over and the wind was too strong. We had a blizzard at one stage that was minus 30 degrees outside, and there were 200-kilometre-an-hour winds. So we had 2 days that we just quietly nursed the ship to find safe harbour as well. And those seas were really big as well. And they came from side to side and backwards and forwards. So the seas were just throwing you all over the place. Because it was early in the season, we did see penguins that were coming up onto the shore to roost. And the really interesting thing was seeing kind of the number of penguins that were there. We had to be really careful because avian flu is working its way down Chile to Antarctica. Avian flu has decimated local bird and mammal populations, so they've lost 90% of their seal pups that are on the coast of Chile because of avian flu, and they're working hard to try and stop it getting to Antarctica. It's probably just a matter of time. So we had to be really careful about when we're going on shore as well, to make sure we are very protective. We couldn't sit on the ice. We could only stand on the ice. We had to use biosecurity measures. And so we had time when we did just stand and watch the penguins, which was incredible, and often saw seals there as well. So Weddell seals and crab-eater seals. We had a couple of scientists on board with us. So we had Marianne Lee, who's a member of the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research. She's a mammal and a bird researcher, and also Jasmine Lee, who's the Australian representative on the Antarctic Scientific Committee as well. They gave us good information, or incredible information, about the wildlife and the weather patterns and things that was happening. But the really important information that we're learning was what's happening with climate change. For us particularly, the sea ice was really low. So you may have read in the papers about how sea ice has been lowest than it's ever been measured before. And there's been an extraordinary decrease in sea ice over this last year, 2023. Normally, apparently, we would have seen a lot of seals on sea ice, which is where they usually go to have their pups. We saw a few seals on land. We didn't see any seals at all on sea ice, because even though we had some sea ice around us, it was small, shattered kind of ice. It wasn't the big sea ice plates that you would normally see this time of the year. What they're seeing in Antarctica is that there's new ice-free habitats emerging. So that's creating a lot more land space where foliage and where flora can start growing. And with people coming down, that means that there's weeds that are coming down to Antarctica and they're able to spread. So the weeds are down there and the weather is warmer, which means that the weeds are surviving that previously wouldn't have been able to before. So that's beginning to change the kind of biodiversity that's down in Antarctica. There's structural connectivity changes. So usually there's a huge amount of ice. That means that the areas that don't have ice during summer are kind of separated, whereas now they're all being linked together. And so that's changing how wildlife is moving between spaces, and again, changing how flora is moving as well. There's meltwater seasonality change. So the way that the glaciers are melting is beginning to change as well. And some of the science around how underneath the glaciers is being carved out by the sea, and that's beginning to change how the glaciers are moving too. There's a huge amount of climate instability. With the milder climates, there's lower establishment barriers for non-native species. So I was talking about weeds that are growing in the area and other animals that are beginning to move into the area. So particularly insects at the moment, which are very difficult to eradicate. Their particular concern is when mice and rats move into Antarctica, because until now it's been too cold for them to survive, but that may change. For some species, there are areas that are increasing for them to be able to breed on. So they're saying for gentoo penguins particularly, there's more areas that they can actually access. But with increasing human activities, and this is something that's particularly relevant for people and for tourism, that's creating more concern as well. Tourism is something that I was quite conflicted about, going down to Antarctica. 5 years ago, I was conscious of my carbon footprint. This time I was even more conscious of it, but also conscious that as there's more tourists, that means that there's more risk of Antarctica changing and the wildlife changing as well. So that's something that has been managed until now really effectively with the IOTA. So that's the International Antarctic Treaty Organization, and they have travel, or they have tourism advice, and most tourist operators will conform to that advice, and they're very particular about how tourism is managed. The United States are not necessarily conforming to that advice, and they're pushing to have a lot more tourists and to have bigger and bigger boats. So that's created a lot of tension within that community as well. The main, there are a couple of days that we had down in Antarctica which were extraordinary. So the photo on the right shows a day where we were able to sit out on the deck, almost suntanning. The sky was blue, the weather was clear, the water was perfect, and it was kind of 2 or 3 degrees. And they're saying, this is extraordinary. We don't have those days. And they're like the kind of days that we have in central Victoria when it's September and we say, oh, it's kind of 25 degrees. Isn't that beautiful? And you go, no, this is not beautiful. This is not how it should be, actually. And Antarctica is the same. So even on that day, we were able to get out and see under the zodiac and watch fin whales feeding and just see extraordinary things. You knew that this was not okay, that the way that the world is changing quickly. So we had 3 days that we traveled down to Antarctica, 2 weeks in Antarctica. We moved around a lot to find shelter when the weather was changing. And then we came back. Over the 2 or 3 weeks, we developed an incredible cohesion between all the scientists that were working on the boat, and really got to know each other very well. And there's been some some great collaborations that have been built between scientists. One Health is a good example of that, looking at sciences from many different areas and how we all need to be coming together, to be working together at climate adaptation and managing things in a far more collaborative way. So that's led to that will hopefully lead to some more, some more cross-cultural and cross-scientific disciplinary collaborations. And so now I'm returned back to Australia and trying to get my feet back on the ground again. It's really hard.
Katie, that's amazing. Thank you so much. No wonder it's hard to come back to reality after that. It must feel like you've been in a different world.
It is. It's an extraordinary place. Yeah. And it is, you're aware that it's a world that humans don't really belong in. It's not where we should be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose we better cover the good and the bad, but what was some of, if you look back and think this is an idea or an initiative that would be really fantastic or that's really got potential, in terms of climate, what was one of the really good things that came out of some of the discussions or collaborations?
There was a policy panel which was attended by, everybody was there listening to it, but there were people at all levels of government. So we had representation from United Nations. We had people who were working on mediation working on mediation for all the different groups that work across like the Southern Oceans and the Northern Oceans. There were people from federal government level, state and local government level, and talking about policy and working together and lobbying as well, and being able to lobby MPs. So that was something that was a really powerful discussion, and having people at all those different levels of government and levels of negotiation talking together was something that was extraordinary. Usually everyone's working in their silos and sees things from kind of their own little small perspective. And I think the other project is the One Health project, which is cross-disciplinary. So recognizing that planetary health is dependent on everybody working together. So those were two really clear initiatives that I think will lead to, hopefully good changes.
That's really interesting, Kate. And, we obviously all read about what's happening in Antarctica and stuff like that. When you're actually there, were you shocked by, how did it compare with what you sort of were expecting or you'd sort of read in advance?
A bit hard to know because like when you're in a blizzard and it's minus 30 degrees and there's ice just it's too cold for snowing, so there's ice just pouring past the window. It feels like this is kind of Antarctica and it's a freezer and you just have no idea. The weather is so wild and so strong and powerful. But then with that really sunny day, you do kind of get a very different sense. And I guess it is like certainly living locally here, you can see seasons change and you see the way that you kind of live the changes over 25 or so years, but having just a really brief snapshot wasn't giving me that kind of perspective. It was more speaking to the scientists, the Antarctic scientists, and hearing their stories about change as well. Yeah.
And is it too soon to ask, I mean, you've done some amazing things. You've got your day job, working as a pain specialist, someone who specializes in helping particularly kids with pain. And you've done so much politically in the last couple of years. Is it too early to say what you're going to take out of this experience?
I think it is. I think it is something that's still just kind of settling in. Yeah. And I'm not I'm not racing into any particular commitments at this stage. So
fair enough. We'll watch that space.
Must have been great just being in a group of women talking about leadership and things, just was that, how was that?
Oh, it just was phenomenal. So every time you sat down for dinner, we'd all sit down on these tables that were bolted to the floor with these kind of benches that were bolted to the floor as well. And every time you'd sit down with a different group of people and you'd be having a conversation about astrophysics with somebody. And there was Susie Ingram, who's a professor from the UK, who just plays with supercomputers in her spare time and measures how high the Andes are. And then she goes to climb them to just kind of check whether that's actually true. So just some of the just extraordinary people that you sit down and were just eating with and spending time with was such a privilege, such an honor. Yeah, it was amazing. And the discussions that we would have at lunchtimes and dinner times, usually not breakfast, but lunch and dinner were just incredible. And to do that kind of day after day for 3 weeks, apart from when a lot of people were out because they were seasick, but most of the days that was just extraordinary. Yeah, and it doesn't happen. It's so rare to have all those people there in one place.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that incredible experience and the photos. It sounds amazing.
Yeah, thanks for asking me to share it.
Yeah, thanks, Kate.
I don't know if anyone wants to ask any questions of Lex or Kate, feel free to jump in. And the other thing that we were really keen to get from people, as Stephen mentioned earlier, is if anyone's got any particular podcasts, movies, books, or anything like that they'd like to recommend to other people for a bit of holiday reading or listening, feel free to pop it in the chat as well. It's sounding like it might be a bit of an early mark for us.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, did you see many tourists? There you go.
We saw about 3 or so ships passing occasionally. But apparently I was being tracked on Cruise Tracker, which is a site that you can go on where you can see where all the local ships are in the area. And people who are tracking from home said that there were ships everywhere. We saw kind of 2 or 3 ships. But I think also we were in a very small boat that could go into small harbors and between kind of in like down channels that most of the bigger boats weren't able to go on. So we probably avoided most of the tourist areas.
And how did you actually get there, Kate? I know there was quite a few flights, wasn't it?
So travelled to Auckland and then Santiago to Buenos Aires, was told that even though I had a boarding pass, I didn't have flights anymore. So I had to get myself down to Ushuaia and then did it all the same on the way back. And so South American travel, particularly in Argentina, is dicey. Like if you can get a flight, you get on it. And when you looked out the window, some of the wings of the planes were being held together with gaffer tape. So that felt very, very brave to be flying in Argentina. It was a bit of a relief to get to Santiago and get on a flight home. That I thought, okay, the wings are okay.
Good. Oh, well, thanks everyone. Oh, sorry, Matt's gone. And would you do it again?
I probably wouldn't, because I don't think that it was such an extraordinary thing for me to be able to do, but I don't think we should all go back to Antarctica over and over. I think we need to respect that it's incredibly precious, and if you do it once, that's all you should really do. Yeah. So I probably wouldn't, even though, and I probably wouldn't be able to recreate that either. So no, probably not.
And you just took handheld baggage onto the plane, didn't you?
I did. I was warned that I was likely to lose my luggage, and I thought, well, what's the point of packing it if I'm going to lose it? So I just did handheld luggage, and then just wore the same kind of sets of clothes over and over again. Did lots of hand washing.
Very good.
Good. Sam, thank you for your recommendation. I'm going to add that to the notes and share that with everyone. That looks really interesting. Good. Well, yeah, really nice to see everyone. Thanks for coming along through the year, and we just love doing this with everybody. So yeah, great to see you on a monthly basis. We're gonna pause in January, but back in February, and we've already been talking about some of the things we want to talk about next year. So if we've got some really exciting ideas, but if everybody else, if you feel like you've got an idea for a speaker or a topic that you'd like to cover, of course, let us know. We'd love to hear that too.
And we get lots of our speakers. I mean, a bit like Judy's here, and she linked us up with Lex. So yeah, please do, if you've got people in your community or you go and hear people speaking. I know, Stuart, you've done that as well recently. Thank you. That is great, because that way we're getting really good, diverse group of speakers and learning a lot as well.
Good.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again. Hope everybody has a great Christmas and a relaxing break, and really look forward to seeing you all again in the new year. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Bye now.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Penny was on.
Hmm?
Penny Nilsson was on. That's nice.
You done?
Good. Yeah.